morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeffrey Sachs, a professor at Columbia University, and absolutely delighted to be the opening moderator for the very important session this morning on the Kazakhstan Forum for Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We have an absolutely outstanding series of panels, and we're extremely honored to have the Prime Minister give the opening address for this important forum. Before we hear from the Prime Minister, I'd just like to say very briefly that the Sustainable Development Goals are the agreed global goals adopted in September 2015 by all 193 member states of the United Nations as the framework for global cooperation until the year 2030. The reason they were adopted is that the world economy is not producing inclusive and environmentally sustainable growth. It's producing growth, but it's producing growth that is unequal, and it is producing growth that is actually destroying the natural environment. The idea of sustainable development is to have economic development that is socially fair and inclusive and environmentally sustainable. So it's three objectives: economic, social, and environmental, not only one objective, GDP. This is a big change of mindset. It's a big change of governance. It is a big responsibility for all countries. No country by itself can succeed unless all countries are taking actions. The Paris Climate Agreement is part of sustainable development to stop the global warming before we hit disaster. So this is a very, very great challenge, and it's inspiring that the government of the Republic of Kazakhstan has taken on the challenge of sustainable development and the SDGs so clearly. We're very, very honored, Mr. Prime Minister, that you are here to open this session. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Prime Minister Askar Mamin, the Prime Minister of the Government of the Republic of Kazakhstan.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, this is the first time a Forum of Sustainable Development Goals is organized in Kazakhstan. And I hope exchange of views and ideas with the United Nations on the matter will become a regular part of the Astana Economic Forum. I would like to take this opportunity to express my deep gratitude to the United Nations and to Ms. Armida Salshia Alishabana, personally for their efforts to build a better and more sustainable future for all of us, for reminding us of the fundamental incorrectness of the nation growth at all costs and the growing relevance of principles of quality, inclusivity, social and environmental responsibility in the global economy. The government of Kazakhstan fully supports the views of the UN on the urgency of the issues of poverty and equality, climate change, environmental degradation, and peace and justice in the world. Majority of the SDGs are deeply integrated in some of the most important state plans and strategies. As today, more than 50% of all of SDG indicators are reflected in the state plan and strategies on economic development, education, healthcare, environment protection, and others. In 20 years, GDP per capita in Kazakhstan increased from 1.1 to almost 10,000. The poverty rate plummeted from 35% to 4%. Real incomes expanded 4 times. We consistently prioritize building strong and predictable institutions to maximize opportunity for small and medium enterprises. Our efforts earned us placed among top 30 most business-friendly countries in 2018 doing business report. Kazakhstan has been making consistent progress in the Human Development Report. As of today, we rank in 58th among 189 countries, which qualifies us as a country with a very high level of human development. The report notes the high level of education. 99.8% of Kazakhstan citizens aged 15 years and older are considered to be literate. We fully subscribe to the international agenda to combat climate change. Kazakhstan ratified the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change in 1995, the Kyoto Protocol in 2009, and the Paris Agreement in 2016. The Astana Expo 2017, dedicated to the green energy, has been a meaningful contribution of ours to the implementation of UN Environment Agenda at the global and regional levels. The advanced Expo infrastructure has become foundation for the International Center for Green Technology and Investment Projects, whose goal is to develop technological solutions and create opportunities for green investments with implementation in Kazakhstan and Central Asia countries. Deep commitment to harmony and peace among various nations and cultures make us one of the most peaceful countries in the world. The Institute for Economic and Peace ranked Kazakhstan number 70 in 2018 Global Peace Index, which qualifies us as a highly peaceful country. Most importantly, many of SDG goals and initiatives are deeply integrated in our overarching strategic document, the concept on Kazakhstan joining top 30 developed nations. The government of Kazakhstan is a strong supporter of the United Nations and the SDG initiative. In 2 months, for the first time since its launch, we will present our progress on the matter in the framework of the National Review at the UN High-Level Political Forum in New York. We hope to share our experience and learn how to strengthen our efforts in achieving further the sustainability and inclusiveness. We are convinced our event today and the forum in July will serve as an effective platform for further promotion of the SDG initiatives. Thank you very much for your attention.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for your opening remarks and also for reminding us how Kazakhstan is one of the world leaders for peace. President Nazarbayev was always emphasizing how we need to shift our spending from armaments to development. And this is a wonderful, wonderful achievement, the peace of this region and Kazakhstan's leadership in that. Without peace, there is no chance for sustainable development. This is for sure. War is the biggest obstacle to sustainable development on the planet, and so thank you for your leadership. We're very fortunate to also have opening remarks of Dr. Armida Salcia Alizabana, who is the UN Undersecretary General and the Secretary General of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. She is a very experienced senior official worldwide, a UN leader, a professor of economics at Pajajaran University in Bandung, also a leader of that university and head of the Planning Commission of Indonesia under President Yudhoyono, so a person of exceptional experience. And now ESCAP, of course, covers half the world, so a big responsibility on sustainable development. Thank you for the opening remarks.
Excellency, Mr. Askar Mamin, Prime Minister of the Republic of Kazakhstan, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be with you at Astana Economic Forum for this first Kazakhstan Forum on Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. In the fourth year of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, I welcome this opportunity to take stock, to assess where we must focus our effort to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Kazakhstan's recent experience is directly relevant. The priorities of Kazakhstan's 2050 strategy are complementary to those of 2030 agenda. Achieving sustainable economic growth, transforming the country into a diversified knowledge economy, and improving conditions for the most vulnerable in our communities, all echo SDG ambitions, as do the priorities of achieving greater gender equality and improve access to healthcare and quality education. With these objectives in mind, the country has reformed and modernized its economy, supported human development, and encouraged entrepreneurship. The business climate now is becoming more and more competitive. Kazakhstan's middle class has grown considerably, and the country is in the top third of countries on the Human Development Index. As private businesses have flourished and human capital strengthened, considerable foreign direct investment has been attracted. At the same time, Kazakhstan has demonstrated its commitment to the 2030 agenda by mainstreaming SDG objectives and linking about 80% of them to national strategic documents. The new institutional architecture established to support implementation of SDG should help further accelerate the progress. On the regional and sub-regional challenges, these are firm foundations on which to build. Kazakhstan has a valuable contribution to make as we consider how to overcome the challenges still faced by North and Central Asia and the broader Asia-Pacific region. Our assessment finds that on its current trajectory, the region will not achieve any of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Significant steps have been taken towards ending poverty, ensuring access to quality education and lifelong learning, and delivering affordable and clean energy. Yet, even in these areas, success can only be achieved by 2030 if progress is accelerated. For many more goals, our progress is still stagnating or heading in the wrong direction. Negative trends must be reversed if we are to provide clean water and sanitation, ensure decent work and economic growth, and support responsible consumption and production. Urgent action is needed to strengthen environmental protection and combat climate change. The mismanagement of natural resources underlies some of the most important gaps which need to be closed by 2030. For all its achievement to date, North and Central Asia also needs to accelerate progress if it is to achieve all Sustainable Development Goals. The sub-region outperforms the rest of developing Asia and the Pacific when it comes to eradicating extreme poverty and hunger and providing quality education. Yet, urgent action is needed to reverse negative trends to achieve gender equality, support decent work and economic growth, and build sustainable cities and communities. On the priorities to accelerate progress, as we work to address these challenges to support sustainable development, let me highlight 3 areas you may wish to consider in your further deliberations. First, achieving sustainable development will require additional investment, which is strategically targeted. Our analysis concludes additional annual investment of around $1.5 trillion is required to achieve the goals by 2030 in Asia and the Pacific overall. This is equivalent to about $1 per person per day on average. The region has the fiscal space to afford it. Yet, mobilizing these additional resources will require a concerted effort. Reforms to increase, for example, tax revenue and private sector investment remain necessary, alongside measures to diversify our economies and empower our people. In North and Central Asia, we estimate that providing basic universal social protection would require an additional investment of about 1.7% of GDP annually up to 2030. Universal health coverage would require another 0.5% of GDP. The greatest investment need would be for the transition towards cleaner energy and climate-resilient infrastructure, which would require about 1.8% of GDP annually. Considerable investment, but for considerable development gains. Second, deeper economic integration between North and Central Asia and the rest of the region would strengthen sustainable economic growth, supported by improved transport infrastructure and trade facilitation measures. There is an opportunity to deliver the economic diversification necessary for more equitable distribution of wealth and to lessen for example, the rural-urban divide. Many strategic transport infrastructure projects are underway, some with the support of the UN system, including our regional commission. We are keen to help ensure social and environmental sustainability remains central to their development. If hard transport infrastructure can be complemented with trade facilitation measures to eliminate non-tariff measures and restrictive rules of origin, further trade and investment gains can be achieved. Automating trade, transit, and investment procedures would also help. We estimate the electronic exchange of trade data and documents between the North and Central Asia could reduce trade costs by about 25%. A United Nations treaty to facilitate this cross-border paperless trade in Asia and the Pacific has recently been agreed. For example, countries in the region have signed and acceded to this treaty, and I hope more countries from Central Asia will follow suit to maximize the treaty benefits. Third and lastly, we need stronger partnerships to strengthen the region's means of implementation to achieve the 2030 agenda. Only then we will have the means to finance, target, and implement the necessary policy solutions to achieve SDGs. North-South, South-South, and Triangle cooperation, as well as multilateral financing mechanism, all have a role. In this regard, ESCAP, as a regional commission, is committed to supporting the intergovernmental work needed, working with sub-regional organizations such as the Eurasian Economic Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In closing, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Kazakhstan and North and Central Asia have great potential to take the Sustainable Development Agenda a step further. Our focus must be on strategically targeting our investment and deepening economic integration to diversify our economies while supporting social development. I look forward to joining forces with all of you to achieve the 2030 agenda in Asia and the Pacific. Thank you for your attention. I wish you a successful forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those excellent and in-depth remarks. Prime Minister Mamin will have to take leave at this point, so let's thank him again for opening our session. We'll move immediately to the first panel, which will include Dr. Ali Zabana and also Vice President Chen of the Asia Development Bank, Jacques Attali, esteemed global leader in economics, and President Juan Manuel Santos, former President of Colombia and Nobel Peace Prize laureate. So if people from the panel could come up, that would be wonderful. We have a wonderful panel of leaders in sustainable development. I'm going to start with President Santos, if that's all right, a little bit out of order, but there's a reason for that, and that is we would not even have sustainable development goals were it not for President Santos and for the government of Colombia, because it was in 2012 that the governments of the world assembled in Rio de Janeiro for the second time in 20 years. That was the 20th anniversary of the Rio Earth Summit. In 1992, at the Earth Summit, sustainable development was adopted, and 3 treaties were agreed on climate change, biodiversity, and fighting the spread of deserts, the Convention to Combat Desertification. And then 20 years later, the governments met again in Rio. And you know what they discovered when they met? That not one of the treaties had been implemented at all. So we had lost 20 years of time because we had these 3 big treaties, the nice announcement, but nothing implemented on the ground. And it was in that context that the government of Colombia came forward and said, we need to put sustainable development in front of the whole world, not only the diplomats, because this has to be a concern of every person on the planet, not only the technical negotiations, because politics would otherwise defeat us. The governments won't move unless the public understands that our survival depends on sustainable development. So this was a remarkable contribution of Colombia. The president might have won the Nobel Peace Prize for that, but he got it for something else. He got it for making peace in his country after 50 years of war. So 2 phenomenal accomplishments, as well as ending poverty substantially in Colombia. So, Mr. President, we're very delighted that you're here. You have been really a key global leader on this initiative. And I would like you to reflect on Colombia's experience in taking on this agenda and what advice you could give for the region of Asia and the Pacific, which we've just heard is home to 60% of humanity. So the future is going to be made in Asia. What should they know? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs, and thank you all very much for giving me this opportunity to address you today on such an important matter. As Professor Sachs just mentioned, yes, we in Colombia were one of the countries that promoted the SDGs. I will tell you very shortly how this came about, because it's a good example of good ideas becoming reality. There was this young woman in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in charge of environmental issues, and she insisted very much on seeing the president. And one day, I bumped into her and said, Mr. President, I would very much like to talk to you about a very important issue. The Millennium Goals are coming to an end. This is in 2011, are coming to an end in 2015. The world must think what's going to replace those Millennium Goals, and I have some ideas for you to put forward to the world. She mentioned that the Millennium Goals lacked the environmental component, had to be much more inclusive, but something that I must underline, this effort should not be only on the shoulders of developing countries, but also developed countries. It's the whole world that must take this responsibility. So I told her, well, it sounds very good. Write me a memo you know I like short memos, and I'll see what I can, I'll reflect on it. And she took out, I have it written for you, the memo was there. I gave it to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I said, why don't you, I think it's a great idea, why don't you start some kind of multilateral diplomacy to get enough support for the Rio +20 summit in the year 2012. And she did that, my foreign affairs minister. And when I arrived at the Rio summit, we had quite a few countries that were already aware and that wanted to support it. And we put the proposal formally in that summit, and the Chinese minister that was heading the meeting, that was chairing the meeting, came down to me and said, President Santos, you come from a small country. I said, it's not that small, we have 50 million people. But you have very good ideas. China will support this. And the negotiations started with many countries, many people, how many goals, what goals, and we ended up with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I remember very well that during that discussion, somebody very prestigious came to me at the very end, and to, at that time, Prime Minister David Cameron of the UK, we were discussing the final draft. He said, you are going the wrong way. And he said, why? I asked this gentleman, I said, you have your priorities wrong. And he asked me, what is the most important investment that the world can make to save the planet? And I said, maybe planting trees. And he said, no, that's the second one. The most important is saving the coral reefs. I remember that phrase because today, the coral reefs, with what we have already done, the world, are dying. The coral reefs, fortunately, can recover. But the ones we have now, with the trend that we have today in today's world, the coral reefs are dead. I wanted to mention that because the urgency with which we have to act cannot be exaggerated. You saw the United Nations report last week about biodiversity. This is something that is very close to Colombia because we are a very rich country in biodiversity. And I think the leaders around the world, and that's why I think this discussion is so important here in Astana, in this economic forum, because we must make many more people aware of the urgency with which we have to act. We just heard from the Undersecretary General what is happening in this part of the world, which is not very different of what is happening in other parts of the world, in my part of the world. And this is a global issue. What happens here affects Latin America. What happens in Latin America affects Central Asia. Countries must act by themselves, but also, and the 17th goal is very important, that in cooperation with the rest of the world, with the rest of the institutions. The experience that I had as president is that this type of policies to work must have the leadership at the top. The president himself must be on top, coordinating the different ministries, putting goals, specific goals, and pushing the people to comply with these goals, to meet these goals. We did that. We had, in the case of Colombia, a special group of ministers. We met every single week, and we, in a way, led the performance of, or the implementation of the SDGs. We were the first country to put the SDGs into law, became a law in Colombia, in the National Development Plan. we were the first country to regionalize. This is an important aspect. In many countries, and in my country, we have different regions which have different conditions. Large countries like Kazakhstan also have different regions with different conditions. So in order to be able to be more effective, you have to subdivide your goals in order to be able to achieve the national goals with much more efficiency. So coordination within the government, leadership, and permanent pressure, not only internally, but externally. That's why I think, and I want to thank Professor Sachs, if there is somebody that has been an advocate of what I'm saying and has been defending, we have a Center for Development for the SDGs in Colombia, which he chairs. His presence is simply his presence there. And 2 or 3 words that he says are tremendously important to stimulate the whole process. So it's with meetings like this one, it's with leadership, it's with coordination that we can maybe reverse those negative trends that the Undersecretary General just mentioned and accelerate the trends that are going well. The progress of the world in many of the SDGs in the last years have been phenomenal, but it's not enough. We must try to do better. Thank you.
Thank you again for your leadership and also for recalling the role of Paula Caballero, who is the woman in the Foreign Ministry of Colombia that played such a great role. And it is a wonderful story, as you just heard, of one person, great idea, going to the president, great idea, getting world adoption, and taking it to the whole world. And we're lucky we have, as the next speaker that I want to call, someone who did something quite similar. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall was falling and the world was changing, Jacques Attali said, oh, we need to do something different. And he had an idea. We need a development finance institution for the new countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And he went to his president, I believe, I don't know all the details, but said, why don't we have a bank? And the next thing we knew, there was the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And it's a wonderful example also of an idea into practice that remains a completely thriving institution. So Jacques, if you could share some thoughts about our current agenda in light of this great experience.
Thank you very much. I will focus on the subject of this morning, which is SDG and the situation of the world compared to what we need to do for the future. You were kind enough to remember that I launched this institution, which means that once you want to do something, you can do it. If you are in a good position politically, geopolitically, you can do it, and you demonstrate it on other issues. But let me provocative on the SDG and on the future of it, and let's make some proposition. SDG is an amazing progress, but look at the facts. As we speak today, I speak under your control, 14 of the 15 countries, the best ranking are in Europe. The 15 is Japan. And they are good, but there is a flaw in the SDG mechanism, which is that that doesn't take into account the real footprint. For instance, if you take my country, France, we are one of the best in terms of SDG, as well as Germany, but in the SDG we do not take into account the spillover effect of imports. And if you take into account the spillover impact of imports, which means that we push the CO2 emission production in other countries, then the result is much worse. Therefore, we have to take into account a global view on the impact of each country on the world, and not only a domestic impact. Which means that on that, much more must be done in order to do that. Personally, with a very large group of people, we have launched an initiative to go beyond the SDG, and I do hope that this will be discussed in due time. We have launched the idea of what we call a positive economy, means economy, and Jeffrey was part of a working group on that at the beginning. Positive economy, it's an economy we work in the interest of next generation. And we take into consideration everything which is in the interest of the next generation, which is a larger footprint than the SDG. And we have begun since 5 years to measure the positive index of each country of OECD. And what the result is very worrying. One, globally, the positive impact of OECD, the positive index of OECD, which means the capacity for OECD countries to take care of the interest of next generation, is diminishing. The global index of OECD is diminishing, which means that in terms of demography, democracy, transparency, debt, ecological footprint, the global index of positivity of OECD is declining. Second, some countries are doing very well, which are mainly the Northern Europe countries. And one of the countries which is one of the best in terms of SDG, Japan, is the last of OECD countries in terms of positive index, which means that there is a flaw in the mechanism and that we must go further in terms of measuring the real consequences on long term, which means that in terms of what must be done, think global, think education, think long-term investment, think infrastructure, and focus less on immediate actions and immediate consequences.
Thank you for making the very crucial point that sustainable development means thinking ahead and thinking at a generation scale, which is not so easy to do because we live, in the United States, we live from tweet to tweet. What will the president's mood be the next hour? Obviously, it's very disorienting, and it's without any long-term consideration. And then we live by the quarterly account. Did the GDP go up 3.1%, 2.8%? But it's a meaningless number, actually, if you don't have a long-term perspective. If your debt is rising, if you're contributing to environmental devastation, all these short-term indicators are just a kind of fraud. And this is a very, very big problem, that we don't measure what is important. We measure maybe what is convenient, or we're just lazy about it. So this idea of really trying to look more deeply, not just at these shallow indicators, but really at the quality of life, is extremely important, and that's a very big contribution. Next, we'll turn to another leader of sustainable development with profound experience. The current Vice President of the Asia Development Bank, Dr. Shixin Chen, has had senior roles in the People's Republic of China and the Ministry of Finance for a quarter century, and led China's role at the World Bank, helped to establish the new institutions, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the new bank, and then joined the ADB as Vice President in 2018. So you've seen development from all these different perspectives. China's role is, of course, the most decisive right now. On the one side, China contributes most to growth. At the same time, it contributes the most to greenhouse gas emissions on the whole planet. And so is there a path right now to sustainable development in Asia, and what role can the Asia Development Bank play and these new other institutions that you've helped to set up, and can they work together also with SCAP to create a policy framework for what is 60% of the world's population? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you very much. The thing in my mind prepared for is that what's the role of the MDBs in the SDG. But you mentioned about my previous experiences in China. Just one thing I'd like to highlight is that during the MDGs, China, worked very hard towards the development and also towards the sustainable development, inclusive development. So the policy there actually at the very beginning of the opening up is that some area to develop, to be able to develop fast and then gradually move to the other areas. So coast area opening up first, and then the economy of the country just growing up, and the capacity of dealing with those the sustainable development, inclusive development increase a lot. So if I'm right, during the MDG period, China actually lifted up of about more than 600 million people out of the poverty. That's arbitrated to the great efforts of the policy. The policy targeted to the rural area, to the gender, to education, to social safety nets. The government set up the very huge kind of policy efforts in setting up like the transfer system in the central government. So big portion of tax, mainly the VAT, levied it, and then redistributed, use the central government's policy to the poor area, to the vulnerable group of people. So this is the way, and but also a lot of lessons, because it's a huge kind of challenge, big country. So it's not easy to deal with those things. So this is my first point. Second point related to my current position, ADB. For this issue, also reminded me when I was in the World Bank as an ED of representative China, I participated in the discussion of the zero draft paper of the SDGs. So lots of debates, discussions, New York, DC, and issues around there. My sense was that UN and member countries very, very highly value the role of MDBs and IFIs. So it's a huge kind of momentum to support the MDBs, IFIs to work on this area. I think maybe three things there. The first one is the MDBs is a stronger financial capacity and the ability of mobilize the coordination in terms of finance. The second one is that MDBs, reach everywhere. So many years experiences, even the last mile of the road, and the villages and the people in the poor. The third one I think important is that policy engagement with the clients, because every project, every TA assessment, you have to engage with the government. And specifically some countries, they want to change the economic system. Then a lot of engagement with MDBs. So those areas, I think this is why UN and member countries are very highly support the role of MDBs and IFI's work towards the SDGs. One lesson from the MDG, the implementation, is that when we discussed how to emphasize implement of SDGs compared with MDGs. So that's the current issue with us, like ADB. So I think we tried in 2 ways very hard. So the first way is how to get our strategy fully aligned with the SDGs. So ADB, last year, ADB finally approved the strategy 2030, built in 7 priorities of the operation. So that is the very fundamental efforts of ADB. I think other MDB as well. The idea is try to make the right the strategy, right the policy, to make sure every cent of our money to be able to align with the SDGs. The second one is how to make it more efficient. So then how to enhance the implementation. So we just follow the strategy and come up with criteria, indicators in a very detail in the climate change, gender, and also how to support the private sector, enable the market failure. So those efforts is full of in our ADB's efforts in a daily basis. I think that's the key things nowadays in MDBs and ADBs we efforts to put there. With that, I'd like to stop here.
Thank you very much. This is underscoring that an agenda like the Sustainable Development Goals is complex. And therefore, saying SDGs is one thing, actually implementing them is another. And this requires a tremendous amount of alignment of major institutions like the multilateral development banks to achieve that. And in that regard, I'd like to turn attention to one specific initiative in Asia and get Dr. Alisabana's view of this and Dr. Chen's view of this also, and that's the Belt and Road Initiative, because this is relevant for all of Eurasia. It's very relevant for Kazakhstan. And the question is how to make it a green, sustainable development initiative, how to align the Belt and Road Initiative with the Sustainable Development Goals. Many of us who are very supportive of the basic concept of the Belt and Road Initiative are very worried about how many coal plants are being constructed under the banner of the Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan and Bangladesh and so forth. And we wonder how to make the Belt and Road Initiative truly an SDG initiative, not an amplification of dangerous greenhouse gas emissions, because if Asia does not get emissions under control, the world cannot have safety. This is the basic point. And I want to remind people that this week in the Arctic Circle, the temperature reached 29 degrees Celsius. So we are already at the very edge of disaster. And Asia is the make or break of the world, actually, because this is where the future is going to be decided. And that means the coal industry first and foremost. So Indonesia, for example, or Australia, or China, or India. And Dr. Alisabana, I wonder if you could make some comments about how this alignment could be made. And also President Xi said at the BRI summit last month that it would become a sustainable initiative. What can we do to help that along?
Thank you very much for the difficult question, actually. Yeah? So, I was also at Beijing about 2-3 weeks ago at this Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. And we also had the opportunity to sign an MOU, actually, yeah, SCAP with Foreign Minister, State Councilor Wang Yi, precisely on this. So MOU on Belt and Road Initiative, but to support the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals in, of course, in our region, yeah, Asia Pacific. And in this MOU, if I may share with you all, there are several principles, yeah, that we would like to adhere to, and also with the support from the government of China, in which first and foremost is the principles of sustainable development, yeah? In which, of course, countries participating in the project or the activities or the program should consent. Yeah? Because this is not only about one country per se, yeah? Because we are working with several countries, sub-region wise, and so on. So has to have countries consent. That's first. Second, also all these sustainable development principles, including environmentally sustainable, as well as the project or activities concerned have to benefit the local economy. So this inclusivity, yeah. Also to benefit the local employment opportunities, and how also from the side of the financing, yeah, has to be sustainable, because we are certainly mindful, yeah, of the previous or the ongoing implementation. There are certain criticism. Yeah? So we take that note, and certainly we communicated, yeah, this concern with the Chinese government, and I'm also happy to share with you that all these concerns are taken on board, yeah, in how we move forward with this initiative. Good governance, international standard, yeah, we put it there, international standard, UN values and norms, very clear, yeah. And going forward, we have in preparation activities, yeah, a project which is for Central Asia, several countries, and we'll see how we can move forward. But certainly, we will adhere to all these principles, yeah, going forward. So maybe this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Dr. Chen also a follow-up, but it also applies to Indonesia, it applies to Colombia. Every place where there are fossil fuels, it's very hard to stop because the politics, among other things, and the economic interests and the income are very strong. And this country, Kazakhstan, depends hugely on oil and gas. And so everybody wants to continue, even though collectively it would be a disaster if we don't shift. Fortunately, every country also has huge renewable energy potential. For example, Kazakhstan has unlimited wind potential, for example, if it would be harnessed. So how should one manage the politics of a transformation when there's a real income source now? No one wants to give it up, but we know how dangerous it is for the planet if we just continue in the same direction. And I'd ask actually all of our panelists to make a comment on that. Maybe we'll go down the row. I'll ask Dr. Chen first, putting you on the spot, and then we'll continue down the row.
Yeah, I think for country, the policy is one of the key area we can highlight that in terms of SDGs. as you mentioned, Honorable Doctor, you mentioned that the top leadership's decisiveness way of that is very keen. But the thing is that how to translate those strategies into the policy could be important. So this is some area like MDBs, like ADB, work closely with the government, make sure the strategy would be able to translate it into the policy, and the policy may be able to reflect the core needed of promoting the SDGs. For instance, renewable energy you're talking about. So here, like in the Central West, it's a huge kind of natural resources, but how to enable the investments to participate could be the fundamental issues. Many areas, it's kind of policy issues, economic assistance issues. Actually, a huge problem is the market failure. So the investments, private sector, just hardly to get involved in that. So I think in our position, like ADB, the key area for us is to help countries to reform the policies, to build up the public management capacities. Then we can somehow to change the doing business environment. Then the private sector would be able to get in. This is the one issue. The second one, as you mentioned, even like technology. One very significant the policy, I don't know, the case is like that. So here we have a lot of the geothermal resources, but it only can be used in the wintertime because it gets the heating. But like in China, nowadays some new technology, even the summertime, the geothermal, the resources can be used as the cooling. But this is kind of a bridge of the technology, how to utilize. Then the efficiency will be significantly increased, pave the way of the private sector to be able to more benefit, to be able, the project would be more bankable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to introduce one person in the audience, if I might, Dr. Adnan Amin. If you stand up, if you have any questions about how to make a renewable energy economy, this is the man to ask. He headed the International Renewable Energy Agency brilliantly for many, many years, which produced definitive studies showing that we can move to renewable energy worldwide. So the work that you did was really pivotal on showing this is real, this is practical, this is bankable, and we need to do it. So thank you very, very much, and great that you're here. Please.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Colombia is also a country that depends mostly on oil and coal. However, we took some very hard decisions and important decisions. We were the first country to put a carbon tax in Latin America. That, of course, was not welcomed by some people, but again, you need political leadership. We protected many areas and prohibited mining and also agricultural activity in many of these areas. We multiplied by 4 the number of hectares that are protected in Colombia from 11 million to 43 million. More than 20% of our territory now is protected in terms of biodiversity, and you cannot mine. But the most important thing, which is what is happening, fortunately, is that technology is allowing the economic rationale to be present in the decisions to switch from fossil fuels to the new technologies and the clean energy. Today, you can demonstrate to a household that solar energy can become a much cheaper source of energy than traditional energy. And that economic rationale is going to be the most powerful from the public policy point of view for countries to be able to switch into cleaner energies, I think, and we must stress that. A great friend of mine, former colleague of former Mexican President Calderón, he's going around the world demonstrating how his house in Mexico, he is paying 30%, 30, of what he used to pay simply because he put in place solar energy. And I think that those demonstration effects are very important. If you allow me, Professor Sachs, very shortly, I would also like to share an experience that we had in Colombia for the implementation of the SDGs that was very, very productive. When we launched the SDGs, simultaneously, we adopted a new way of measuring poverty. Instead of the traditional way of measuring poverty by income, we adopted what Professor Amartya Sen, Nobel Economic Laureate, called the multi-dimensional index. You measure poverty by what the basic needs of a household has or doesn't have. Does this family have access to health, access to education? Does he have a decent living? Does he have IDs? Does he have employment? And you have a series of factors. And you go each family, you make a census, and then you target your investment. When I was hearing the Undersecretary General about strategic targeting, this way of measuring and fighting poverty allowed me and my government to target much more effectively our limited fiscal resources. And the return in terms of the fight against poverty, but also of the SDGs, because there is a synergy. You start putting the different factors that you want to attack or to address, and then you mix them with the SDGs compliance, and that gives you also a very effective way, practical way to invest in a much more efficient way your social and fiscal resources. So this in Colombia had a very important impact. Colombia was one of the countries who was able to lower poverty more and lower inequality more of all of Latin America in the last 7, 8 years by adopting this new way of fighting poverty.
Great, thank you. Very important, the targeting and the efficiency.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just would like to respond to the question by giving one particular example on how we can benefit from this intra-regional cooperation. Intra-regional meaning, for example, within Asia-Pacific, there are sub-regions cooperate. ASEAN, for example, just one example, because I come from Indonesia, I know quite well ASEAN with Central Asia. In the case, one particular case, in the case of this energy, because it was mentioned as one example, energy, renewable energy. In the case of ASEAN, they have this ASEAN Master Plan connectivity, Master Plan on connectivity, and one of that is on this ASEAN grid, ASEAN grid on electricity. They already have that, they are implementing that, and what we add value to that cooperation, in this case ESCAP, we also work with them on how also to increase the renewable energy content, yeah, or as the primary source of this electricity generation, based on the renewable energy potentials of the countries concerned that are part of this ASEAN grid. Yeah, so we did that with a particular study with the ASEAN Center on Energy and so on. So this is one example that we were also thinking, yeah, whether this is also a good idea in the case of Central Asia, yeah, because Central Asia is, I'm sure, is also have this great potential to develop this energy infrastructure connectivity. Yeah? But how then also to build in more and more renewable into this initiative. Thank you very much.
And I think in this regard, it's also worth mentioning China's fantastic initiative called the Global Energy Interconnection Development Cooperation, GuideCo, because this is really a vision of an interconnected grid of renewable energy. So if GuideCo and BRI would get together, we would actually solve this problem. And I think it's two fantastic Chinese initiatives. Jacques, you have the last word. Wrap it up for us.
Oh, well, I will not dare to do that. Just 2 or 3 comments. One, there is only one country in the world, only one, where the global strategy of a government, a comprehensive strategy of a country as a whole, is focusing on the implementation of SDG, is Sweden. And then if you want to know what to do to implement SDG, just go to Sweden. Look at what they do. SDG is everywhere in the country comprehensive behavior. Second, as I said, SDG is far from big enough. We need to do more and look at what is the impact of on next generation, not on today. It's what we call in my foundation positive development goal, PDG, not SDG, positive development goals. And if you look at that, that gives you index of how you could give to such institutions as the Asian Development Bank and other institutions, and even private funds, an index to measure what is the consequence of my investment on next generations. And then I would dream of a world where no investment is done without knowing the impact on next generation, where no company will receive money from shareholders, where no private equity fund will invest in a company without asking what is the impact of on next generation of this investment. If the financial institutions, either public and private, if the private funds, if the IFIs are doing that and do not invest without a positive impact analysis of their investment, then the whole world will change, because we will not finance anything which is contrary to these goals.
Excellent advice on 2 points. One, if you want to see what to do, look at Sweden. It's a good general principle. And second, measure the future, measure your impact on the future. I think these are very, very wise words. We're going to move immediately to the next panel, which will be moderated by one of the leading experts and scientists here, Dr. Rakim Oshakbayev. The panel will start immediately, but before that, please join me in thanking this wonderful panel for these great remarks.